Quite an entrance. Thank you, Dan. Put this down. I'm on. Do I just turn this off? Okay, great. Wonderful. Dan, I am not going to wear the cape the entire time, so if you can come back. I'm a professor, so I get to wear robes, but this is even a little more exciting to get to wear a cape because, as you can tell, I have a very non-conventional teaching style, but I bet you're going to go home today and you're going to remember at least one thing from our time together today, because that's what I learned is called a significant learning experience. Significant learning experiences in teaching are ones that you will actually remember something. So my goal today is to hopefully not, even though I'm a thanatologist, is not to bore you to death through PowerPoint, is to really ask you to open up your imagination, to use visual arts and the arts as teaching methods and teaching tools for yourself and for your clients. And that's a little bit about how Superhero Grief was born. But before I begin, I really want to thank our sponsors and Thomas McAfee for Funeral Homes for having me today. I think it's a really important message that they're sending, a leadership message, giving you the time and space to really talk about self-care. You know, we can all talk the talk of self-care, but actually walking the walk is really important. So I think creating an event like this to really focus on your self-care and giving you time, these 3 hours together this morning, to really learn skills or to change a behavior or an emotion that's related to caring for yourself while caring for others. Hold on, let me see. Do I just do this myself? So I'd just like you to take a moment to look at this really first slide, because I think it completely encapsulates what we're talking about today. There we have the image of Superman, one of the very first popular comics here in the United States, born out of World War II, and actually born out of the creator's loss. Siegel and Schuster, who were 2 young men out of Columbus, Ohio, their folks came actually from, they were part of the big migration to the United States, fleeing the Third Reich, and they were first-generation sons of Jewish immigrants. And in high school, they created Superman. It used to be some back lore that they created him to be cool and kind of look like a guy who can maybe attract some female partners, but actually Superman was born out of their own loss. Schuster's father died when a gunman came to their store, their family store. They don't really know now to this day whether the gunman shot him or there was a heart attack. I think he died of a sudden heart attack from the fright. And Schuster and Siegel created, a week later after their Passover Seder dinner, they created actually Superman as a comic, 2 teenage boys from Columbus, Ohio. And that out of that, really, if you look at themes of Superman, Superman's name is Kal-El, El meaning God. He is made in a godlike figure, but he's not God. He has super strength. He came to this planet from Krypton because of the potential annihilation of his people. He lost his parents. And woven throughout themes of Superman is really a symbol of anti-oppression, a symbol of hope, and a symbol of strength. And it's interesting that they made him bulletproof, because I think that also speaks to Schuster's own loss. But in 1941, when Superman came out, he was really a symbol of hope, what was going on in World War II. And all comics at that time were banned in Nazi Germany and all the allied countries of Nazi Germany, because they were afraid that it would create too much of a symbol of hope for oppressed people. So we think of Superman as impenetrable, we think of him as the man of steel, but Superman's really goal is to kind of help others. That's really his moral code. And I think this picture completely encapsulates a helping professional that, you know, he's sleeping. Do we ever think of Superman as resting? I don't know if you do. I just never think like he rests at all. So It's about how we show up for others if we can't show up for ourselves. So I hope today's going to be a really significant learning experience for you. So we have a lot of ground to cover today in the next couple of hours. So if you need to take a break, we do have Q&A at the end. So please do write down your questions that you may have at the end. But before we begin, this new material might be new to others. I'm sure self-care, if you're in pastoral counseling, social work, psychology, any caregiving profession, we could talk to a lot about self-care. This might be new material for you, or it might be a refresher. But as I say to my students, I don't like to just talk the talk. I like to walk the walk. So I'd like everybody right now, before we begin, to take a moment if they want and just stand up if you'd like to. If you'd like to, not everybody likes to breathe in. Take a nice breath in. Breathing kind of centers us. Breathe in for about 5 seconds. Hold it for 5 seconds. Breathe out for 5 seconds. I would encourage everybody, if you'd like to take a stretch somehow in your body. I have actually developed back problems and neck problems because of all the sitting and straining that I do, stationary distress at my desk. Maybe stretch your arms up. Okay, if you're ready, you can sit down if you'd like. And I'd like to give everybody permission that if you need to get up, if you need to take a break, if an image bothers you here, because we will have a couple of things that involve a little bit of disruption, blood. There is a scene with blood and pain. To get up, to take care of yourselves if you need to step out. I have an adult son with a disability, and so sometimes I have to step out and take phone calls. So please, I want to give everybody permission to do that here. But why are we talking about self-care as a superpower? Well, we're talking about self-care today as a superpower because, it's well documented in the gaps that social workers, people in the grief and loss world, pastoral counseling, funeral workers, it's well documented that there are some major gaps in self-care. Does anybody agree with that? Maybe a show of hands. Okay. There's also a high risk for burnout in our fields. When I got into social work, I'm going to say like 25 years ago, first thing my supervisor did was say to me, I really, in my job, being here for 30 years, what has helped me with burnout is kind of changing my position every 5 years or doing something different. And I think that really stuck with me because in my 25 plus years of social work, I have done very various things from research, teaching, therapy, the trifecta, I call it, teaching, individual counseling, program management, research. So that's really helped me use different sides of my brain so that, to really kind of avert that burnout, and also peer support. There's also chronic stress in our profession. We're dealing with not such light subject matters. And so we're taking in all that stress on an everyday level. Maybe we're seeing many, many clients a day. Maybe we are working with many families in the toughest times of their lives. And so we're dealing with chronic stress, and we also are in a parallel universe with our own chronic stress going on at home. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And, if we have too much chronic stress, it could affect not only our health, but it definitely affects the quality of care. I know that, how I show up definitely has a direct effect on my clients. So our mission today, because this is all about a mission, is we're going to try to help to understand self-care not just as a luxury, but since the pandemic and the need to really amplify self-care, self-care has become an ethical imperative. I think it always has been. And we're going to talk about that as an imperative in our professions. Hopefully we can learn some about the emotional hazards of our work, our health, our well-being. And again, for some of you, this might be new material. This might be an opportunity this morning just to be a refresher, to remind us, because I don't know about you, but I get distracted a lot, and sometimes I have to pause to be given a reminder about some of the occupational hazards of my job. And today we're going to identify some of the villains of self-care and kind of what gets in our way, and discover new or latent powers to help us in our quest for self-care. Now, I don't necessarily have all the answers for self-care. I don't think anybody does, but hopefully you could take away some of the things today that will have a small rippling effect on your health, well-being, and your work. All right, so here I am. There's a lot of reasons why I love Batman. Batman's a big symbol for me. I'll share personally that when I was younger, my mother worked, I'm originally from New York, and my mother worked at a big hospital in New York City, and she actually happened to work with a woman. Her name was Doris, and Doris was the sister of Bob Kane. Bob Kane was the co-creator of Batman. And we didn't know that because she never really disclosed it to my mom until one day when my sister had a life-threatening illness that almost became life-limiting when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And I guess Doris had told her brother, who had been in town in New York, he was originally from New York but lived out in California, and just very unpromptly, Doris comes into my mom the next day and hands her these 2 cards. And they are sketch cells from Bob Kane of Batman and Catwoman, one to me and one to my sister, and one to my sister hoping a speedy recovery for her from Catwoman, and one was for me, Batman and Robin. And that left such an impression on me as a 9 or 10-year-old kid, because it was what I feel a very heroic act. That's what real true heroism is that Doris didn't have to disclose her secret identity to my mom, and neither did this cartoon maker, basically a very famous one, to take time out of his busy day to make 2 cells for 2 kids, because one of them was in the hospital and the other one was a sibling. And that always really stuck with me. So Batman's really a symbol, and I grew up in New York, so Batman and Gotham City and Spider-Man. But Batman's also one of my favorite characters. You'll see I'm very DC, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Because Batman is also, does anybody know this? Does Batman have superpowers? No. Batman's one of the only real superheroes where if you watch the Ben Affleck version, the Flash asks him, "What's your superpower again?" He goes, "I'm rich." So that coupled with he's a genius, he's the world's best detective. But Batman's also a homicide survivor. His parents, you really look at it, and that's how part of superhero grief was born, was doing a presentation on the Christopher Nolan film Batman Begins, which has really embedded in it, is really a story about a traumatically bereaved child, and how grief, that kind of traumatic grief, or grief and bereavement and death in general, can split a person, split your identity. The person you were before the person died, and who are you in living with loss? What kind of new meaning and purpose do you have in your life? How do you transform? Do you become a villain to yourself and others? Do you walk a path that oftentimes, if you really go back and read a lot of these superhero stories, which are mythological stories, by the way, they're just modern mythology, to use as sort of parallels what goes on in life. Bruce Wayne needed to really find new meaning and purpose in life, but he felt split. He felt like he had a dual identity. One where he put on the mask, and the mask represents a lot. How many people have to put on a mask when you're grieving and go out and do your job and go out and take care of your kids? Present yourself in front of others. Sometimes the mask comes off. And sometimes you feel like the mask stays on because you can't separate yourself. The mask could be healthy, the mask could be unhealthy. But Batman has, his biggest superpowers is that he has both vulnerability and strength. He goes through a lot. He pushes a lot of people away. He doesn't want to have attachments, but he finds out later on that he really needs to learn how to trust and have attachments. And he has a team around him. His symbol also means call on the heroes. The symbol, when you put the symbol out, the bat signal, it's also a symbol of hope. But getting back to today's lecture, I'm going to say to you, when Dan and the McAfees asked me to come talk today, and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Hoy, recommended me to come talk, I said, I am heroic self-care. I am probably a really good speaker to talk about this, but I'm going to tell you why I'm the worst speaker to talk about this. And I'll start with the story of a couple of weeks ago when I was sitting in my office pretty much all day, and my husband pokes his head in, and he goes, hey, honey, you've been in there all day. Do you think you want some dinner? I was like, not now. I'm working on my self-care slides. He's like, but I don't think I've seen you use the restroom. I don't care. I got to get these in. They're already late. They're going to be late. So I am really good to give this talk because I'm sometimes really the worst person at self-care. And I'm going to start with the number one reason why. The number one reason why I am the worst, if you look behind my initials, it said DSW, MSW. I am a social worker of 25 years. That makes me one of the worst people to talk about self-care because social workers, any social workers in the room? Yeah, okay. We talk the talk about self-care, but we do not typically walk the walk. So I think that puts me at a high risk for not really being good at self-care. I can step you through the last year and a half of my life. So in the last year and a half of my life, before my husband and I'm a remarried widow, just got remarried in June. And we thought it was a good idea 2 years ago. We both had veterans education benefits to go get our MBAs because I needed to use mine before I got remarried. So yeah, I rolled after 3 degrees. I decided it was a really good decision to get another one. At the time, my mother-in-law was, unfortunately, she had in her 80s and she had cancer and she then had to go on hospice. So my actually good self-care brain, my husband wanted to kind of keep barreling through classes. I said, no, we need to take time off, so we're going to do that. I was also planning a really large wedding by myself. In my 50s now, I don't have people around to help me, so really large. That happened in June. I got a new university job. I have a private practice. I'm writing a second book in the series for superhero grief that's actually due at the end of this month. I have an adult son on the autism spectrum. He's high functioning when he's high functioning. He's not high functioning when he's not high functioning. My daughter just had a total joint replacement, hip replacement at 28 years old, and she had to come move in with me, and I had to help her sell her apartment because she had developmental hip dysplasia. I have frozen shoulder, so I have some of my own health issues that are going on. And I had the chronic stress of all these work demands in my family. And my best friend died in 2024, a woman that's another social worker who is a best friend and colleague. So I had a lot going on in the last year and a half. Some, as one of my really good peer mentor colleagues would say, if I looked at that list, some of them are things that we can't control, and some of them are things, maybe, I don't know what draws me to the profession. I don't know if the personality draws people to social work, that, we're kind of overdoers. And we really like being too busy with our hair on fire. And we're never really settled because we just need to have things going on and programs. And I could do that support group. I think I have 2 hours on a Tuesday night to be able to do that. So I don't know if our personalities are drawn to the profession or if sometimes the profession just enhances that. But the one thing I do have that I've kind of honed as a superpower over the last 25 years is that I am acutely aware. And here it is, I am very self-aware that I can run myself ragged. And why do I say that? Because if you look up, one of the number one things for self-care is your own self-awareness. But awareness with just awareness, without action, is really nothing. It's just awareness. But being self-aware is extremely important. So in that self-awareness, I made sure several years ago to assign one of my good friends and colleagues who was willing to take up the job, take up the mantle, because as you saw how I responded to my husband when he came in and poked his head in. I screamed at him and I was doing self-care slides, that I have nominated an accountability partner. So before I came here last week, I was at my desk again, and my accountability partner called me up, and she said, have you gone out and taken a walk today? I was like, I did not. She reminded me I needed to. So maybe try to find an accountability partner. That's really important. My family's also my accountability partner too, except they don't have the power that my friends have, because I have your family you can kind of banter back with a little bit. So I also got a dog that needs to be walked. And that was really important. Pets could be really important. My dog needs to be walked. She's a large German Shepherd. And if she's not walked, if you watch Cesar Millan at all, the dog whisperer, she becomes a really hyper dog. So her hyperness rubs off on me. So maybe it's a little self-serving, but she gets me out and she gets me walking. I incorporate self-care into all my classes. I schedule breaks for myself. About 2 years ago, I was sitting so much at my desk for about 10 hours, I developed something called, I can't even remember it, my legs swelled like this. It was called some kind of it was an edema. I thought I had a blood clot in my leg. And that was a real wake-up moment that I shouldn't sit at my desk all day. I needed to change my diet from salty foods to low-salt foods. I've learned to accept support. How many people here struggle? You're really good at helping other people. How many people here struggle with accepting support? Anybody? Yeah, that's another good characteristic of us, yeah, helping professionals. So I've also learned my triggers. And the one thing is I've learned to say no and let some of that go. That's really hard for me. It has. Sometimes when people ask me to do things, like actually coming and speaking here today, there was an engagement I got asked to speak next month. I said, nope, I want to dedicate my time to the McAfee seminar, the Reef seminar here, because it's really important. I don't know if I'm going to have the bandwidth and the energy to do it again, but I was tempted. So I just want to reframe for you that self-care, I've had to learn this in 20-something plus years, is not selfish. Self-care is actually so important to do our jobs. Not to care for, it's so important for our well-being, but our well-being is good for our families, it's good for ourselves, but it's also good for the work that we do. So, so who takes care of others takes care of those who take care of others. So we see this actually in the superhero comics in DC. This was during the height of the wars back in 2018, 2019, right after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And a veteran, along with a guy who worked for the CIA, went to DC Comics, and they came up with this idea to write about something called Heroes in Crisis. It's a limited edition. And they wanted to explore the human side of what it was like to be a superhero, making metaphorical references to soldiers, to people in combat, to first responders, to military, police, people on the front lines who are doing that work. They wanted to explore the human side of the psychological side of trauma and healing for superheroes, because we often see superheroes fighting external battles. This was really a huge leap for DC to say, our superheroes, there is a cost to what they do, and looking at really their internal battles. And so they created, in Heroes in Crisis, a place called Sanctuary. And Sanctuary is where superheroes go to, it's like a retreat for superheroes, where they go and there's respite, They take care of themselves. They get mental health counseling. And one of the biggest things that's really important, if you see here, is peer support. I've worked with the United States military for about 15 years. I still do some consulting work with them. I'm also a spouse of a combat veteran. And my late husband was also a naval military officer. So I've had a lot of time around the military, and I work with them too on the civil service side. And so one of the number one things we find in military families and military and first responders is the importance of peer support. So having a place or having a person where you can relate to, where you can feel open to talking, feeling safe, feeling someone's relatable, they can understand what you do every day, is your sanctuary. So, I mean, who creates sanctuary for us? We have to. Today is a sanctuary, in a way, a place for you all to come together, to learn about self-care, to think about it, to have a moment, and to provide support to one another. These tables are filled, which means that you are here not only just for yourselves, you're here to be with your peers, to talk about self-care, respite, need, talk to one another, connect with one another. It's extremely important. If I didn't have my peers, sometimes I work in teams and sometimes I work in complete isolation. Isolation is the worst place to work in. It can. Isolation is a risk factor. It's a risk factor for a lot of things. It's a risk factor for self-care because you need to be able to process and debrief and connect and talk about the work you do, especially with people who are undergoing trauma and loss. Because you hold that space for everybody and it becomes a part of you. So in order to be able to process it, release it, to talk about it, to join it, and this is why places like the VFW and the American Legion and other places were created for our veterans so that they can connect and support and talk to one another about their experiences. I can't talk to people who really don't understand what it's like to be a social worker who works with folks who are traumatically bereaved and people who are bereaved and grieving. If you ever go to a cocktail party and you tell people what you do, they just do this. They're like, ugh. Does that happen? Yeah. I don't even tell people on a plane what I do anymore because that's like the worst mistake ever, especially if you have a really long flight and you're sitting next to somebody. I don't say what I do. They're like, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a consultant. Okay. I work. I've gotten trapped on a plane for 5 hours, and my empathetic self and compassionate self wants to be there for someone whose loved one has just died, but I also need to disconnect and put my headphones on, and just zone out for a bit and listen to music. So, we need to create sanctuary for each other. It's really, really important. And I think leadership needs to create sanctuary. So, we're here today because even superheroes, no matter how much selfless sacrifice that you have for others, we need restoration. I love this picture of Batman kind of meditating. It's really important. He needs meditation. Mindfulness actually is one of, Bruce Wayne learned ninja skills, but part of what he has to do is he has to extremely be able to focus. So being able to restore yourself, even superheroes need restoration. Even folks that work every day need some type of restoration. I look at some of my colleagues, and as much as I admire their drive and their passion to do this work well into their later years, I'm in a middle life now, and I look at my colleagues, and part of me really admires that they're out there because it's really a calling for them. Some of them, I look at them, I'm like, I just don't want to subscribe to that kind of workaholism. And I have a saying that I kind of came up with that to one of my colleagues who I said, you got to slow down. I said, my goal now all of a sudden has become that one of my visionary boards or life goal has been I want to start smelling the roses more before I'm pushing them up. And so that has become a life goal of mine, is that I need restoration in my life. I've noticed that if you look at the dual process model, anybody here familiar with the dual process model of grief and loss by Strober and Schut? Is anybody here familiar with that? Okay, so it used to be the Kubler-Ross model that was, she really started the conversation. A lot of kudos to her because we weren't talking about death, dying, and bereavement. But like anything that evolves, we used to think the world was flat. We know now the world is round. Science does evolve. And Strober and Schutt were two researchers who really looked at thousands and thousands of bereaved individuals and said that we really live in, once our world has been kind of upended through loss, that we do live in a world where it's a dual process that goes on, that we live in loss kind of consumes us when we're grieving, but we also need restoration. And so we kind of weave in and out. When initially a loved one first dies, we're really in the landscape of loss. Pain is something that takes away all our focus, and understandably so. We can't really focus on a lot when you're in so much pain. And so we live a lot in the world of loss, but somehow life knocks at the door. When I was widowed at a very young age, and I had 2 children, and as much as sometimes I wanted to just sleep all day, I had a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old that needed to get up, go to school. They grounded me. And in a lot of ways, that was part of restoring some of my life. So even in the deepest, darkest moments of our lives, we do need some kind of restoration, whether that's practical restoration or emotional restoration. And so I think it's really important that we look at that. Even the people that work with others who have so much pain, so much trauma, so much loss, do need restoration. It's important. So we can't just live in, we cannot live in one mode of being because it becomes unbalanced. We become unbalanced. And if we're unbalanced, how can we teach other people or model to other people about being balanced? How can we learn to help others, companion them, to learn to live with loss? Not that loss, pain, grief ever goes away. It's about how do you manage your pain? How do you learn to live with it? How do you learn to move forward somehow in life to find some kind of joy and affirmation again? Obviously, as a species, we've learned how to do this. Because look around you. None of us would be here if we haven't. So somehow, we have to put that foot forward. But we have to really be able to restore ourselves in order to help others restore. So I'd like to just take a moment we're going to watch a clip from the new, I'm going to set the scene here. The next slide is, has anybody here seen the new James Gunn Superman film? Okay, we have a couple of people. So they do a couple of reboots of superheroes in different universes. This past summer in July of 2011, James Gunn, who's like the new director of DC, he's rebooting it, has done a sort of a new story arc of Superman. They keep some of the old features of Superman, but they keep they introduce new ones. So in this scene, and I'm going to just give a little bit of a content warning. You are going to see blood. You are going to see some pain, and you are going to see some destruction. So if that is disturbing to you, I invite you to take a break, walk outside. It's not super graphic. But in this scene, Superman is out trying to save the world against Lex Luthor and some of these aliens. And people are starting to kind of lose a little bit of faith in him because he's actually showing, the big theme of this film is to actually show Superman's humanity, because he's mischaracterized as this superhero that is impenetrable and invulnerable, and in his name, Kal-El meaning God-like, but he's not. People project that symbol onto him. And we do that. We project some God-like qualities onto our first responders, onto our doctors, onto our healers. But he's not. And so I want you to take a look at this film as he's tired and misunderstood. It's one of the first films you're actually going to see Superman bleed. And I think that the makers of this film did this for a reason. They're really trying to show Clark Kent's human side and really trying to show that, like a lot of us, Superman has both strength but vulnerability. that they coexist, that there's never really one true super person or super being in the whole universe. So I'd like for you to just sit, watch it, and take notes, because I'm going to ask people, what do you think when you watch this scene Superman really needs, or Clark Kent really needs, so that he can go out and do his job? There are things that he needs to be able to restore himself and also be the Superman that he wants to be and wants to show up to be. But there are things in his life that he needs.
Crypto, take me home. Home. Crypto. Home. Thank you.
No need to thank us, sir, as we will not appreciate it. We have no consciousness whatsoever. Merely automatons here to serve. Meet 12. She's new.
He looked at me.
14 fractured bones.
Damage to bladder, kidney, large intestine, lungs.
With a healthy dose of yellow sun, we'll have you up and at 'em in no time.
Level 4?
292 times Saharan Prime, please, One.
He's back.
So every time I watch that and I think about the question I asked you, I always get a little bit choked up. Superhero stories were made by humans for humans to talk about the human condition. It's really most of our parables and stories and oral traditions in life with mythology. But would anybody like to, I'm going to call on people, when you watch that clip, what does Superman really need in his life? What helps him? What does he need? Anyone? Relationships. I'm sorry? Support. Healing. Home. Is that what you said? Yeah. Purpose. Right? Anyone else? I can't hear, sorry. Self-acceptance. Yep. So you saw Crypto who thinks he's kind of joking, the dog. That actually kind of makes me laugh a little bit. But how about pets? Our fur family, like his dog Crypto really loves him. But Crypto comes in. Pets are important. Medical care. He needs to take care of himself. And part of his medical care, because he's from Krypton, is the sun. I love the Tauntauns because that's a representation of what we really kind of don't want to be, is just a Tauntaun that takes care of people that has no feeling or consciousness. That's what you can become when you become burnt out and numb. Also needs, as people have said, relationships, family, a very close relationship with his father, and the human touch. He needs his team. If you see the team coming in to kind of help him with the monster, he doesn't work solo. He likes to work in teams. He needs teams. They don't necessarily get along. He needs meaning and purpose, going to the Daily Planet every day. Besides going and working and doing the heroic things he does and tries to do, is that he needs other meaning and purpose in his life. That's exceptionally important. And last, he also, in a way, needs a calling. He knows that his profession is a calling. There are other people who are calling for him. And he provides hope. So he needs some hope for himself. That's what S means on his planet. S, the symbol that he wears, is not S. It actually means hope. So that really kind of demonstrates to me a lot about the character of Superman in his most human form. But so let's take a moment now. We're going to get into the sort of academic part of this. What is self-care? Self-care is, in short, self-care is the deliberate practice of maintaining one's overall well-being while balancing the demands of life and preventing physical and emotional exhaustion. It's the intentional practice of activities. Now I want, again, intentional practice. I don't know about you, but again, by my example, I have to be really intentional about my self-care. Last night, this is my very first time in Greenville, and I'm staying downtown, and I really wanted to go out and walk around because it's such a beautiful downtown area. But I went and got something to eat, and I went to bed because I knew I was going to have to talk today. But I was super tempted to go out in your beautiful city here. But it's the intentional activities and behaviors that individuals engage in order to maintain and improve their physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. It's both preventative to maintain balance and recovering from stress or fatigue. Balance is extremely important. And the World Health Organization, it's in 2019, which is interesting, the date if you look at it, looks at as self-care as the ability of individuals, families, and communities. Individuals, families, and communities. So communities embracing self-care is also really important. To promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and cope with illness and disability, with or without the support of a healthcare provider. So this is all about our own, wellness. Now, because we're multidimensional, and also that I'm a social worker, I look at this through the 5 dimensions of self-care. So first, we have our physical self-care, We're looking at Maslow's hierarchy. I tried to get to sleep last night because sleep is important. Has anybody worked with someone who is newly bereaved and having trouble with sleeping? I know in my life, when I was taking care of my father on hospice, I could not sleep. I had trouble sleeping at night. He also had what I call the sun dawning effect, where he'd be all day in pain and then up at night. So my sleep became disrupted, and it really affected my ability to care for him. And I had remnants of that for many years. So things like sleep, nutrition, exercise, and medical care. That's number one. Without that, number one, Maslow's hierarchy, we're not going to be able, that's stabilization, to be able to stabilize ourselves. Second is emotional self-care, managing our stress, engaging in hobbies, therapy, expressing feelings, or emotional self-care. I shared a story yesterday in one of the in-services we did that because of the work I do, and for many years, this day actually is very poignant for me personally and professionally. I was living in New York at the time 9/11 happened. My dad was on a subway underneath the World Trade Center. My sister was on the subway going into her job in the city. I was on a military base with my late husband, and my mother was actually at her office in Queens facing Manhattan when 9/11 happened. We had 30 people in my community who died. My father's best friend was killed in the towers, and my aunt's best friend's daughter was killed in the towers. It's a day I'll never forget. But it really changed my trajectory being on the mental health hygiene team, a newly minted social worker who started in oncology. Any of us that had grief and bereavement experience were conscripted and on-the-job training, and I provided mental health response for about 2 years through something called Project Liberty. But you're like, where is she going with this? So where I'm going is that over the years, then working for the military and working with a lot of traumatic death, because that really segued into, for me, working with people, I would say, with more natural dying into what I call an unnatural death and violent death. Over the years, I worked with a lot of parents, and when my daughter started driving at the age of 16 or 17 years old, despite a little bit of her having ADHD, which worried me, and living in the Northern Virginia area, I started getting so much anxiety that I was holding her back from driving. And my family really couldn't understand it. My friends couldn't understand it. The people who understood it were my peers. I had worked with so many people and had so many colleagues where kids had died in car accidents that my anxiety was just like through the roof. And it's something I still actually have to work on today. And she's 28 years old. So, going into my own therapy at that time was really important to really manage my own emotional self-care. I could work with others that this was happening, but I really didn't know I was taking in all that trauma myself and it was affecting my life. Social self-care, building supportive relationships are extremely important in the work that we do. Setting boundaries. I struggle with these. I'm a social worker. It's kind of part of the job. I feel like I have a skill to give people, and sometimes I need to be able to say no. We'll talk about that later. And spending time with our own loved ones is really important. Loved ones, friends, doing something outside of our work. Unfortunately, we live in society where a bit of workaholism, and sometimes even in our own agencies or places we work, that kind of promote, if you look on social media, promoting working and working all the time seems to be a very large trait here in the United States. I go to Europe, it's a little bit different. I'm not saying either one's better. I'm just saying maybe there's a strike of a little bit of balance. Professional self-care, our workload management, supervision, professional development. Doing things like professional development are important. I love doing professional development. It's really important for me to develop myself as a professional. It's important for me to look at my workload. If I have any type of control over that. Supervision. I know even at my age and stage and skill level in life when things are over my head, and I need to then go to people, my mentors in this field, that can still continue. Even though I'm a supervisor myself, I still seek supervision. I am always a student, even though I'm a teacher. I think we all should adopt maybe a little bit of that philosophy. And our spiritual self-care, whatever that means to you. Practice nurturing meaning, purpose, and connection. These are so important because sometimes in the work we do, it could seem really meaningful, but it also raises a lot of existential questions about meaning and the meaning of life. So having that connection, being able to meditate, prayer, spirituality, if those things are really important to you. And I had a client who said, in my life, I'm not an atheist, but I'm agnostic. I said, because he had a friend that died, and I said, well, do you believe in the Force? And he kind of laughed. He was a 27-year-old kid because he was wearing something Star Wars on his shoes. And he said, yeah, I do. I was like, well, how do you connect with the forces of energy and other things? And for him, his really tapping into that force or that spiritual side was him getting out in nature, hiking, doing things with friends, planting, gardening. So that was really important for his spiritual self-care. So we often don't really recognize it, but we do have what we call occupational hazards in our profession, in loss, grief, and death care professionals. I think it's important to, in this lecture today, to, whether this serves as a reminder, a refresher, or is it new to some, to kind of name and recognize and validate, to raise your awareness. These might be terms that you're pretty familiar with, but I think a refresher is extremely important to really understand the occupational hazards of our job. Because you don't often, when you're in school or even in professional development, you may talk a little bit about these, but this is really important that we recognize the awareness that what we do does have some hazards. So, first of all, some of the common hazards in our profession is that it's often high pace. Anybody here have a really slow pace at work? You can just be honest. Anybody have a slow pace? You should show of hands. Anyone's pace slow? Okay. Anyone's pace at work pretty high? Yeah. So typically we have high pace positions. There's a lot of emotional labor demands on us. Emotional labor, not physical labor demands, but emotional labor demands. I used to see clients in my private practice back to back to back to back. Don't do it anymore. I give myself at least a 15-minute to half an hour break. I don't care if it extends my day. I needed to do that for my own, to be able to be emotionally present for other people, but also to be able to really take all that in and process it myself. Physical demands. Some of our jobs are physically demanding. People do lifting, going to seminars, running around. We tend to have long and irregular hours. As one of my colleagues said, in death and loss is a 24-hour job. And so sometimes our hours are in the morning, they're in the evening, they're on the weekends. We have, frequent exposure to death, loss, and trauma. And we have the expectations is we have a high duty to care, whether that comes from our own employers, but I would venture to say that most of us kind of have that professional ethical value. Before I came to this today, last night my colleague was like, oh, you're gonna do great. I'm like, oh, I'm such a perfectionist. I need to make sure I have my slides read at least 5 times. I have that duty to care. It's pretty high. And I think that also draws some of us into our profession. I just disclosed that I went to therapy. I always say to people, you should never go to a therapist or a counselor or anybody that hasn't sat behind the chair with a therapist themselves. Never. Because we live in parallel to our clients. We are in life with them. And we have our own stressors, our own pain, our own things that are going on in life. And it's really important for us to work on our stuff so that we try our best that it doesn't show up in the room with the people that we're with. Now, working in loss and grief, is that always possible? Because, the one thing about loss, and especially loss by death, is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how and who. It is what universally connects us as human beings, is that loss is universal to all of us. And so when we're working with people who have had profound and significant or any losses in their lives of a loved one, and we have our own, it's really important that we also attend to our own grief, because we don't also have the luxury of being able to just not and work with clients who are grieving as well. You know, I, as a parent, had to be a grieving parent while my children were grieving. I had to work with critically ill and terminally ill people while I was grieving. But it was important for me to make sure that I took my short-term leave. I took the leave I could. I was very upfront with my employer about my capacity. I was able to then, because I had a good discussion with my supervisor, balance some of my workload. So help seeking is really important. And we also have psychological and emotional hazards due to the nature of our job. And we're going to talk about some of those in the next couple of slides. So I actually, again, have worked with a lot of military and first responders. This comes from the VA. And this met the criteria. The work that happens for stressors for funeral and grief workers actually met the criteria and adapted this to what they call the chronic stress model. So in the chronic stress model, part of what you all do has, and it goes circular, high emotional labor demands, exposure to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, exposure to grief and trauma, physical fatigue and burnout, stigma around help seeking. And again, this was written for stress first aid, for operational support for first responders and military folks. Pressure from families and expectations, long and irregular hours, frequent contact with death and loss. So it's a constant kind of chronic stress continuum that we're all working and living in. One of our biggest occupational hazards, and this is a picture of Tony Stark, who is Iron Man, if you're not familiar with Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, from Avengers Endgame, is when Thanos meaning in Greek meaning death, Thanos, who's the character, snaps out half the universe and they disappear because he's trying to balance the universe. So half the universe disappears, they die. And half of his friends are dead, Tony Stark, and half the universe. This is grief overload. Has anybody here, by show of hands, ever felt like they experienced grief overload in their job? It's okay to be honest. We got some kryptonite in the rooms, make us vulnerable. Yeah. So what is grief overload? When someone experiences significant multiple losses in a short period of time, it leaves that person insufficient to process one before they're processing another. And it's very common with people in the funeral and grief service, in healthcare, disaster response. Disaster response is, when I worked, again, I wasn't downtown 9/11, but I was in the aftermath in the community. And living on Long Island at the time, I will never forget a couple of things. Number one, I grew up on Long Island, and I grew up in the flight path of LaGuardia and JFK. The sound of planes to me is normal. What was not normal was the silence. Planes were grounded for like 3 days. Being on a military bus, the sound of jets was normal for me. Not where I lived and grew up, so that was a very abnormal experience. But what I'll never forget is that Long Island was a very social place with restaurants. For months when people went out, the restaurants were quiet, and everywhere you drove for about 6 months, you saw funerals and caskets. And not even knowing these folks, some of them I knew in my community. It didn't matter, they were fellow Long Islanders. It was overwhelming and it was a lot to process. I know when both of my parents died within 14 months of each other, I was taking care of one and then all of a sudden taking care of another. So that kind of grief overload is, common in our profession where the exposure to repeated death and loss is frequent. We are exposed to a lot of trauma. We can be. Trauma is very different in a way. Trauma is something that really never, ever, in some sense, goes away. Trauma is something that we teach people and learn to cope with and manage, much like grief. But trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that it overwhelms our ability to cope. That's why when grief and trauma happen simultaneously, trauma always trumps. We kind of help people simultaneously, but trauma symptoms always trump because we have to get people to try to regulate and get a sense of safety, grounding. This is where, in terms of restoration, it's really about stabilization. Well, you're working with grief, but you have to be able to work on with trauma symptoms first. And so it often overwhelms our ability to cope, and it threatens our sense of safety and stability. I gave the example of my daughter. So that kind of vicarious trauma, even though I haven't had anybody in my family die in a car accident, it definitely has made me really leery of my family's safety. I'm really aware of it. I happen to actually work now a lot with firemen who go to a lot of accident scenes. I've had to work on my own nervous responses to driving just in the recent last 5 years because some of this still plays in the background of my head. So it may result from direct exposure, violence, death, disaster, or personal harm. But what we experience a lot, so we can have our own direct trauma. Again, I think I shared that I have had sudden losses. I won't name them all, but some of them have been some traumatic, sudden losses, and that's been direct trauma in my life. But for the most of us, a lot of us experience what we call vicarious trauma. And I like this picture here of Wonder Woman because it really depicts her. Wonder Woman has a really, really solid heart, and she wants to go out and really help the world. But when our superpowers hurt us, how do we cope with vicarious trauma? She puts herself in a lot of dangerous situations for people. So the key point here is not just about the symptoms, but the shifts in cognitive perspective. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So vicarious trauma is really the cumulative internal transformation. This is really important. That occurs in professionals as they work with trauma survivors. It affects us internally. It's an internal transformation. And it leads to long-term changes in worldview, beliefs, and a sense of ourself, our safety, trust, control, intimacy, meaning. I will tell you from working with spouses and being a widowed spouse myself of somebody who died suddenly, one of the things that a lot of spouses who've lost a loved one that they're close to, and I say that because spousal relationships are very dynamic and different. Some of them are close, some of them are conflictual, some of them are not close. But for people that have lost loving partners or spouses that they're close to, it can really affect their attachment. And so attaching to another human being, we kind of see this with the character Batman, because he loses his parents or are murdered, and that's a ripped attachment, and that affects our neurobiology. Dr. Ted Reinierson talks about how sudden traumatic loss affects our neurobiology, very synonymous to what's called the phantom limb syndrome, and that we're constantly looking for that attachment, especially in the early days, weeks, years. When something is ripped from us, we're searching, searching, searching. And when we come to understand something, an attachment that we've lost that's so near and dear to us, it can create, in terms of intimacy, not wanting to attach to someone close to you again. A real shift in viewpoints. People that have endured or suffered the loss of a really, I'm going to say, dear partner or spouse, say, I never want to go through that kind of pain again. When people ask them, have you found somebody else? Which is always, that's a whole other lecture about the double messages that widowed people get. Oh, you're dating too soon. Are you dating yet? That's a whole nother lecture. But, not wanting to sometimes because their whole view on attachment has changed because it's so painful. Think about someone that has lost a really dear animal, a pet family. I recently had a friend who was at our home, and we were in Virginia. We were all away together. It was another couple friend, and he had his elderly bulldog with us, and his bulldog died right in front of us when we were on vacation. It was 12 and a half years old. It was hot out. The dog had some breathing problems. He loved this dog. He was a combat veteran. He'd gone through a divorce with his dog. He loved this dog. He knew the dog was getting toward the end of his life and critically ill. But Antonio, he will not get another dog again because of the suffering he felt the love and suffering are intertwined. And so, grief is what Dr. Kathy Shear up at the Center for Complicated Grief would say, grief is the price we pay. I like to say it's the tax, but grief is actually our love. You don't grieve something that doesn't have meaning to you. So vicarious trauma, I'd like to give an example of this, again, for the shift. An example of this could be a bereavement counselor who works for many years with children who have lost their parents to sudden death. Over time, the counselor has not directly experienced that kind of loss herself or losses, but begins to notice the subtle but lasting changes in her worldview. She becomes hypervigilant about her children's own safety. She feels the world is unsafe and she can't trust others. Although that first one, the world is unsafe, lately what's been unfolding in the last several, months, that could be not a cognitive distortion. She can't trust others. Trust becomes a problem. She struggles with emotional numbness. Now, emotional numbness came up in a conversation yesterday. And I want to say something a little bit about numbness, because I forgot to actually say this in the conversation yesterday. Don't always dispel numbness as something that's bad for you. Numbness, if you actually study, I don't know about you guys, but I grew up with National Geographic and Mutual of Omaha. My dad used to always love this, and we'd watch like animals out in the wild, like lions chasing antelopes and being eaten, and to this day, the older I'm getting, the more I start crying when I start watching that stuff. The older I'm more sensitive. I'm like, oh, that poor deer. But when, it's a terrible analogy, but it's true. But our brain, just like animals in the wild who are being eaten, their endorphins actually set off chemicals that make their bodies numb. When we go into shock, numbness protects our brain from being overwhelmed. There are some people who have been in accidents or things that have happened to them and they just can't remember. It's probably, in a way, a really good thing. So just be careful with numbness. Evaluate your numbness. Talk to people about it. Sometimes the numbness is there as a protective factor to be able to do the work that you do. When you become too detached, too dissociated, too not caring, that's important. But numbness isn't always bad. Sometimes it gives you the ability to protect yourself, to put yourself in dangerous situations in order to help other people. Numbness doesn't always mean not caring, but there is a fine line. So, and then this bereavement counselor begins to question her meaning and hope begin to erode. She questions everything. This is vicarious trauma. It's not simply stress or burnout, but a deeper cumulative shift in her beliefs, her values, her worldview. And it's a result of empathetically engaging with others' traumatic experiences. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on and not give too many examples. I'm going to go back to secondary STS. The key point here is that it looks very much like PTSD, but the exposure is indirect rather than direct. And sometimes it's used interchangeably with vicarious trauma. I'm going to get to a slide that's going to talk a little bit about the differences. Burnout. Burnout is, I like this one of the superhero and the villain kind of running by, and he's like, I don't care. Do you ever have a client, and I'm going to just like kind of be vulnerable here and kind of self-disclose. Do you ever have somebody like cancel on you and you're like, oh, thank God. I just got an hour to catch up on my notes. Or like, hey, I can go and, walk outside. But burnout is, that's why I feel like the superhero is doing there. Burnout's a state of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment by prolonged work stress. Not trauma per se, but linked to chronic workload and systematic stressors. I graduated with my MBA last March with my now married husband in June. I gotta tell you, I was like, I am fried. I am burnt out. I am beginning not to care about things. Ooh, big sign. I needed to start making some changes. And one of the changes is, and I knew this was important, really monitor what I call my self-inflicted stress, taking on more than I can chew, because I hit a level of burnout that was synonymous to working through COVID and working 6-7 days a week and writing a book and being with my loving family 7 days a week. So compassion fatigue. This is really the cost of caring, is when our emotional and physical exhaustion just reduces our ability to empathize or feel compassion for others. I remember sitting there with one of the bosses I work with, and I'm not going to name names or anything, it's a long time ago, and we're working with bereaved military families, and she had worked with a lot of trauma and stress, and she didn't really realize her level of burnout. And she's on the phone, and she's typing, and she's listening to a newly, bereaved military survivor. Oh, I feel so sorry for you. Type. Oh, that must be so horrible. Type. I was like, wow, that is something I never really want to model. And so, you can present as a compassionate person, but, this includes elements of burnout and fatigue. And then it spills over into your everyday life, because then you become, in a way, a lot less compassionate with the people in your life. And so it can have a direct effect on not just your work and the quality of care that you give to others. We have to kind of diligently, and we're going to talk about this later, diligently use our superpower of compassion. Compassion can be a strength. It can also be kind of a risk for us. You have to be really important with it, because my family knows I'm compassionate, my friends know I'm compassionate, my clients know I'm compassionate. But if we're overly compassionate, and we're compassionate all the time, we can burn out from it. We can't be all things to all people. And just like Superman, we can't be everywhere. We can't, he can save the world sometimes, but he can't save the world all the time. So this table is really for you all, which shows sort of the core features and the typical causes. I want to highlight here the difference between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. That secondary trauma, there's indirect trauma exposure. Vicarious, there's cumulative client trauma exposure involved in that. And before we almost get to our break, because we're getting there, here is a tool for all of you that if, they share the slides here. This, again, is adapted from Stress First Aid. This is a stress continuum. And I want you to look at the green, the yellow, the orange, and the red. When they give you some of the slide handouts, these are what I say, oh, I'm in the red zone today, or I'm starting to feel like I'm in green. The red zone is, green zone is I'm ready, I'm healthy, I'm steady, I'm balanced. Yellow zone is I'm starting to react mildly, I'm irritable, I'm tired, I don't have time for people. The orange zone is that you're starting to get injured. There's persistent distress. You start to see sleep disruption, withdrawal. I know when my stress is really heavy, I have such sleep problems. I actually have one of my coping skills that I try is I keep a notebook with a pen next to my bed so that if I'm thinking about it, I can write it down and get it out of my head. It does help. And then, clinical concerns or depression, PTSD, looking at our substances. I was in Greenville last night. There's a nice restaurant I went to. There's nice glasses of wine around here. It's nice to have a glass of wine if that's your thing. But looking at how many, when a glass turns into a bottle, it turns into 2 bottles. It could be a lot, So looking at our substance use and misuse, and maybe even our own, I don't hate to say it, I'm going to call it out. Our own thoughts of suicide. Really important that we make sure that we relate to our colleagues that it is safe to be able to come to us, to talk to each other. That is not a sign of mental weakness. It is not a sign of, there's no stigma involved to talk about your own mental health and well-being. Showing up, being part of that team, and making it okay can actually save lives. To have those conversations, those heroic conversations. They're scary conversations to have, but it's important that we make sure that we're not just open to our clients, that we're open to our colleagues as well, if you see any signs. So when I said self-awareness is my greatest superpower, it kind of is. So why is, before we actually take a break, because we're getting there, so why is self-care an ethical imperative? So it is part of our professional competence. If you look into all our codes, whether it's ACA, National Association of Social Workers, Funeral Directors Association, compassion, fatigue, burnout, and vicarious trauma can be impairing. It's part of our codes. The key point is that self-care is ethically required to preserve the emotional and physical health. So practitioners can fulfill our duty to care. We have a duty to care. It aids us in maintaining sharper judgment and the greater capacity to support families. And it's written into all our ethical codes. So I want to reiterate that. It is not just a luxury. It is part of our ethos. It's also part of protecting clients from harm. Families who are grieving are vulnerable, and they're very highly sensitive to the care that they receive. If a practitioner, how you show up is exhausted, detached, overwhelmed, you may unintentionally cause harm. Can you imagine when you have a client walking through your door, if you come in? Now, I cannot say this has not happened in 25 years. You walk in, you're late, your hair is kind of, I'm just getting my son off to school, I hit traffic. I've got to take a moment to kind of center myself before I walk in to the room with somebody else. But, it can lead to us being rushed, not listening carefully. It's hard enough to listen with a third ear and to be present and show up for somebody. But when you're completely distracted, that can really be harmful to a client. So we have this ethical principle of non-maleficence, of do no harm. And that requires, us to show up not impaired. And that means just not impaired from drugs or alcohol. That means not impaired from some of our own emotional distress. It is a requirement in social work that if you really feel like you are in a significant amount of distress, that you really in some way hand off your clients and you are required to go and care for yourself. So attending to one's own needs helps workers remain compassionate and present with clients. We're also modeling healthy coping for the bereaved. Now, we don't want to model unrealistic coping. I practice from a very Rogerian, humanistic approach with my clients. I am human, and I think that is one of my strengths and my superpowers that I'm able to really convey to my clients. Sometimes I have not fully broken down in tears with a client, but I have shed tears with a client. I have done things to model, hopefully, a strong sense of presence, but my own humanity to somebody else. I'm very, very, very selective in what I disclose personally, but if I feel like it is appropriate, I will. And that conveys, because sometimes when you have people who have had a loss in their family, I do have clients that show up and they want to examine you. You know, have you ever had this happen? So they want to be able to relate with you on some level. So, you know, we can be role models how to live with loss, to show balance. And practitioners who demonstrate their own self-care can demonstrate resilience and healthy boundary settings. I often talk to people who are grieving about having their own healthy boundaries. You know, if you can't go out shopping right after your child just died, that is okay. You don't have to go to the Thanksgiving the first year if you don't want to with the family. Setting a healthy boundary for yourself. It might be too overwhelming. How do I do that when I'm not practicing that myself? So modeling adaptive coping can help normalize grief and provide reassurance to bereaved families. And it's also upholding our professional ethics. Ethical practice requires not only serving clients, but also maintaining the practitioner's ability to do so responsibly. It aligns with our ethical standards, and it emphasizes, you know, acting good for others and professional responsibility. Neglecting self-care violates these principles, as impairment can compromise. And this is actually written into the code of the Association for Death Education and Counseling. It requires, in order to, you know, it really says there for people who work in death and dying, that practitioners engage in ongoing and self-modeling and really seeking support when they need to. And I think it comes up over and over and over again for helping professionals because we're so good at helping other people that it almost seems in a way unnatural to help ourselves. We're there for others. That's really our meaning and purpose in life. And if that's our meaning and purpose in life, if we do want to show up for others, and I often say this for spouses that, you know, are working, have their children, it's important for you, yes, to grieve and care for yourself. But in order to show up for your kids, you have to care for yourself. And so it's important not to miss medical appointments. It's important to take care of your health and your nutrition. It also speaks to the nature of sustainability in our profession. Sustainability. When I teach at the master's in social work level, okay? And I remember many moons ago when I was in social work school, my social work professors called me up. They're like, if you're in this job to make a lot of money and not be stressed out, there's the door. So yesterday I kind of asked people at hospice and some funeral workers, like, what got you into your job? I'm always really curious, like, what gets people into their jobs? People I meet, have some interesting people I've met in my life. I'm like, what gets you into your job? But I don't meet a lot of people really in life that are 18 or 19 or college level kids who are like, I am just, this is going to be a really bad joke, dying to get into the grief and loss profession. There's very few people like that. And then some people, if they're on the overly morbid side, you kind of have to be like, wow, that's a little, you know, that's a little overdone. But normally, sustainability in our profession, it should be kind of a collective ethical concern. I mean, constant exposure to loss and trauma. When I tell people what I do, they're like, I don't know how you do that. And then you go home and you're the parent and legal guardian of an adult child with autism, who I love the kid. When he's on, he's on. When he's off, he's off. So sometimes I feel like, gosh, I'm just mental health 24/7. And some days I'm not. Some days are great. But, you know, constant loss and trauma can shorten careers, burnout. And we saw this quite a bit in the last 5 or 6 years. I actually switched from full-time private practice into teaching because I felt like 5 years of the pandemic really burnt me out. And I needed to switch to a different side of my brain. And I needed to go to private practice a little bit more part-time. I needed to switch into the teaching mode. And so we know that qualitative research has showed us that when end-of-life care professionals engage in proactive self-care and compassionate support methods, they are better able to sustain their capacity for compassionate care. I come back sometimes from conferences, it energizes me. I have to also be careful because I think I can accomplish like 15 other things I didn't think I really could ever do. So by caring for ourselves, workers protect both their personal well-being and really sustainability in our profession, which is really important. It's really, really important. Because when we tell people sometimes what we do, how much we get paid, and everything else, they're like, why would you ever do that? Why would you? Because I love what I do. And I discovered that many, many years ago, that when I sat with a couple of people and I was able to kind of sit with them through their pain and not take it on, somebody told me, I think you have a gift and a skill. And you know, we are in people's lives at one of the most intimate times and personal times of their lives where they come with their hands in their hearts, and there's, you know, to be with people during those times, to me, is an honor and it's a calling. And so in order to be able to continue to do that calling, I also need to call upon myself to kind of find my own powers to take care of myself while I could take care of others. So with that said, we're going to take a self-care break for about 15 minutes. You can meditate, get a cup of coffee, do what you need to do. I will see you back here in 15 minutes.